Good evening and welcome to the Houston Public Library series called Critical Conversations. It is so great to have all of you join us this evening. The Critical Conversation series is now part of Houston 2036. HPL, the Houston Public Library, is the leader. We've been involved with Houston 2036. In fact, the idea of 2036 was kind of born in 2016 and 2017 here in the early days of the Houston Public Library. We're proud to say that the Houston 2036 Task Force on Equity is growing, both in membership and people involved, but also the organizations joining us. The Houston 2036 Coalition is now the University of St. Thomas, U of H downtown, Holocaust Museum, the Urban League, Institute for Spirituality and Health, and the three leadership groups: American Leadership Forum, Leadership Houston, and the Center for Houston Future. Now I got to turn to Randy real quick. Can I leave anything? I got it. Thank you. All right. It is a great group, and it's a growing group, and we'll continue to add organizations and people to the 2036 movement. Why 2036? For those of you who may not be familiar, because 2036, in a sharp 13 years, our city of Houston will celebrate its bicentennial. And so the question becomes, what type and kind of city do we want to have by 2036? What are the issues? What are the questions we need to address now, so we won't have to be talking about them in 2036? What do we talk about when it comes to what is the fair, ethical treatment of all human beings? All human beings' lives matter. All human beings are equal. All those things are on the table, and they all deal with one key component, which is equity. And the road to equity is through empathy. There is no equity without empathy. So as we continue to grow this series, those of you who joined us on January 21st at the University of St. Thomas for the wonderful day of symposium looking at social, economic, political, and spiritual dimensions of equity, this is the outgrowth of that. As we promised you, we're going to take the evening once a month to build on those three: social, economic, political, and spiritual. This is the social feast focusing on urban public education. We wanted to do these series so you'd have more time for questions and dialogue, because we're very limited on that day, on the 21st, Saturday, at the University of St. Thomas. So the format tonight is our wonderful speaker, Dr. Ruth Lopez Turley, will present to us. Her and I will then sit in these, what I call them, the high chairs, and we will have a little short dialogue between the two of us. And then we'll open the questions to you, the audience. So the real idea is this. I could probably, and I made a few notes, because if I didn't make a few notes, I'd be here too long. I could probably couch this in many, many ways this evening, but the easiest way I think to do it is from my perspective. I've been doing this work here in Houston for 50 years now. Mayor Turner is my 8th mayor that I've worked with or for. The mayor who's going to be the wonderful person in Discovery Green on August 30th, which is the city's birthday on 2036. The 64th mayor into the first year of her second term will be the mayor for 2036. What's her speech? We should start writing it now. Are we going to be talking about urban public education the way we've been talking about it for how many years in this city? With the same schools at the bottom of the list, with the same test scores, with the same numbers, because of the gap in funding. Dr. Turley is going to tell us about the gap. We're not going to talk deeper about the gap when we sit here at that table for a minute, because it is all about the gap. So we are GAP people, which stands for Great Action People. If I'm standing in somebody's congregation, church, parish, temple, synagogue, or mosque, GAP means what is God's action people going to do. All right? So the question is, it's on us. It's on the citizens. It's on the constituent. It's on the congregant. It's on the customer. It's on the consumer to decide what they can do. Everybody says we want to do something to help urban public education. We have to give them that reason and what they can do. Give them a job. Give them a task. The schools are already segregated. We're now in a majority-minority school district. The book many years ago that many of you are familiar with in this room, Savage Inequalities by Jonathan Cole in 1991, talks very clearly about what's the reality and what's the problem. All of you are educators, understand that. I'm looking at Dr. Flowers, our wonderful trustee from ACC. So glad to have you here. Bob Harvey, the head of the Greater Houston Partnership, he's been talking about this for years. He understands it probably better than most. It all boils down to action. We've done the talk, we've done the research, we have the data, we don't need to study another thing. We just need to figure out what's the action steps and make it happen. Brown versus the Board of Education is 69 years old this year. Next year we'll be celebrating the 70th anniversary. Yay, of Brown versus Board. What has changed? I'm a child of the 60s. I feel like I'm living 1968 all over again. Let me say it again. Clearly, in almost every aspect, I feel like I'm reliving 1968 all over again. So the question becomes, what are we going to do? So to help us try to figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, I could talk about Dr. Turley Ruth for another hour. There's a long bio. I'm not going to even read that. I'm just going to give a short little synopsis of what I want to say about her as soon as I find the page, which is right here. Director of the King Institute at Rice University. The King Institute does data research, engagement, and action. She is the founder of the Houston Education Research Consortium, which many of you know about. Over the last few years have been involved with. She's a graduate of Stanford and Harvard Universities. She's a native Texan from Lubbock, Texas. Yay.
Laredo.
No, I'm sorry, this is Laredo, right? Laredo. Right there, says Laredo.
Different, very different.
Very different, very different. Laredo, thank you. We won't even go into the differences. And this past October, she was selected by President Biden and appointed to the National Board of Education Services. We are grateful, we are pleased, we're happy, we're thankful, we're blessed to have Dr. Ruth Lopez Turley with us, the head of the King Institute at Rice University. I'm going to turn it over to her now. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. I'm excited to be here and to share some information before Larry and I have our conversation, and all of you as well. But I just want to start off by saying that I can't think of a better way to mark Houston's bicentennial than by focusing on equity, and to start the work now so that we actually have something to celebrate at that time in 2036. So what I want to start off by doing is I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what I mean by equity, because there are lots of different definitions out there, and I'll just use my definition. You don't necessarily have to agree with it, but at least we can have a conversation on the same page if I share what I mean by that. So to start us off, since I'm focusing on education, if we take children and we focus on two sets of factors. There's the input, and then there's the output. And so for children, when we talk about inputs, we're usually talking about their resources, their access to resources at home, at school, or in their community. And not just the kinds of resources that we normally measure, because they're easier to measure, but also other resources that are harder to measure. So this is a broad definition of inputs. And then when it comes to outputs, there's also a really broad definition of outputs. We're talking about it could be performance in school or other life outcomes, like their employment or their salaries. Are they able to make a living, an adequate living, in order to support their families? Their imprisonment rates, all of those kinds of things, behavioral outcomes. There are lots and lots of outputs that we could focus on. But here's what I want to make clear at the outset when I talk about education. When it comes to inputs, I believe that we should aim for equitable inputs, meaning that we should make sure that we give more to those who need more. So this is not equality, this is equity, and in the way I'm using this word, I mean that we should give more resources, especially when it comes to educational resources, that we should give more to those who need more. However, when it comes to outputs, I'm actually arguing that we should aim for equal outputs. And this is where some people might disagree with me, but let me explain. So sometimes people think that I'm referring to individual outcomes, and they might argue with me and say, well, how can we possibly expect equality across individuals? And I would say, no, we can't expect equality across individuals. We're all different. However, as groups, on average, whether we're comparing groups by gender, or by economic status, or by race and ethnicity, or by English learner status, I expect to see equal outputs on average by group for the South. So Texas is investing about $10,000 per pupil per year, and that raises several questions. First of all, that does not take account of regional cost differences, right? So what it costs to educate a student varies from place to place. A big chunk of that, for example, are labor costs, right? And what it costs to pay adequate pay, obviously we all know that we don't pay our teachers adequately, but even then, what it costs to pay them is different from place to place. It costs more in urban areas, and it costs more to educate a student in poverty than it does to educate a student who is not in poverty. And it costs even more to educate students in poverty who are in a school with a high concentration of students in poverty, which, by the way, is what we do all the time. All the time. And right here, we have schools that have a very high concentration of poverty and other schools that don't. And by doing so, we are actually making it more expensive to educate students in poverty simply by putting them all in the same set of schools. So I would like to suggest that we stop doing that. And not only because it's the right thing to do, but also because, guess what? It actually saves us money. And potentially a lot of money. So what I want to, I want to also mention that for the school districts in Houston, this is the amount of money that is invested in their students per year, and that is even lower than the statewide amount. That was about $10,300. In Houston, our districts are investing more like $9,000, some of them $8,000. There are a couple that are investing $10,000, but most of them are really the $9,000 and $8,000 range per year. The question that I want to land on is this. So how much does it actually cost to invest in students, especially our poorest students? Because remember, we're focusing on equity here. We want to bring them to a place where they are actually receiving equitable resources. And in particular, how much would it cost to bring them to, say, average outcomes? National average level outcomes. Well, there's a team of researchers that actually came up with an estimate of this cost. Because when we're having these conversations right now, this week, our governor is having all these conversations about how great we're doing in our state, in how much we are investing in our students. And I'd like to say, well, let's take a look at the research and what it shows in terms of what it would actually cost to bring our poorest students to average outcomes. This is what it looks like. So if we take, so I'm going to spend just a moment here, bear with me, and if anything is unclear, please feel free to ask about that, because I want to make sure we're all clear about that. So if we take the highest poverty students of each state in the country, so the highest 20%, the top quintile, those are the highest poverty students in every state, and we estimate, based on those states, how much it costs there to educate students there, poor students there, and this includes things like labor costs and concentration of poverty and those kinds of things. We take all those factors into account in order to estimate the cost of educating our poorest children in order for them to have average outcomes. This is what the scatter plot looks like. So what we see is another clear linear pattern by state, so that in general, the larger the funding gap, Larry just mentioned gaps a moment ago. The funding gap, that is the gap between the current spending per state and the amount that is needed to bring the poorest students to national average outcomes. So the bigger the gap, the lower the performance. Right? The further the states are down here, the lower the performance in general. That's the first thing to notice. The second thing to notice is that there are actually a few states whose poorest students are actually performing at national average or even above national average, but look at how much more they are investing in their students. I need to make that point clear because sometimes people are tempted to throw their hands up in the air and say there's nothing we can do about this. This problem is beyond our reach. We cannot help these students. We'd like to, but we can't. I'm here to say that's not true. We have data that shows that when we invest properly and equitably in our poorest students, they actually do better than the national average. There is hope. We can do this. So I just want to make that absolutely clear. The other thing that I want to make clear is that this is where Texas is. So this is our funding gap. So we would need to increase our funding, our per pupil funding, by $12,000. So on top of the current $10,000, this is in addition to, right? Yes, in addition to, this is a gap, right? So we're currently spending about $10,000 per student, investing $10,000 per student. We would need to invest an additional $12,000 in order to bring our poor students up to national average outcomes.
Can you do that one more time?
Yes.
Overall, what it means, I got lost in that.
Yeah, that's a little bit complicated. Thank you for asking that. So in the state of Texas, our current spending is about $10,000, but we've estimated, or this team of researchers estimated, how much more would be needed in order to bring our poorest students, poorest 20% of students, to a performance that is here at the national average, because right now they're performing down here. So in order to get them up here, the estimated cost is an additional $12,600. Which is about $22,000 per year per student. Now, some people will respond to this and say that's too much. That's ridiculous. And I have to say two things. One is, I just said, there's a clear return on that investment. We know that it will have an impact, and especially if it's combined with other efforts, in addition to funding. It will have an impact on those students. It will improve their performance and therefore improve their life outcomes. So we know that. The other thing that we know is that in Texas, does anybody know how much we spend, and here I will say spend per inmate? It's a lot more than this. And I'm not talking about the 10,000. I'm talking about what I'm arguing for, the 22,000. It's a lot more than that. Now, granted, there are a lot fewer inmates than there are students. But still, in principle, that is making a statement.
What's the cost?
Yes.
What is the cost per inmate?
Oh, per inmate. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but I know it's a lot more than 22,000. Somebody should look this up and let us know during the Q&A. Please do.
Google that.
Somebody look this up. But I can assure you it's well over 22,000 per year. So, and we know through research that when education levels go up and performance goes up, what goes down? Crime and incarceration rates, they go down. It's all connected. So I can assure you that earlier when I was talking about the return on this investment, I was just talking about educational, direct returns on educational investments. There are whole other returns that we can expect. So I'll end with that because I want to leave time for conversation and questions because we have a lot to talk about. Did you find it?
It's 22.7.
22.7. Oh, I thought it was even higher than that.
This is Texas.
Okay, good, Texas. Good. So that is what I think we should be investing per pupil, not per inmate. All right,
All right, let's thank Liz for that part. So, here we go. My questions are going to be very simple, only a couple of them, because I really want to get everyone in the audience involved in your Q&A. And I'm going to pick my words somewhat carefully here. We have heard, not only from you, but from others over the years, about the gap. It has ranged from 5,000 now up to 12,000. I think a while back it was 5,000 something. So now it's 12,600
for our poorest students.
for poor students. The question always becomes, the same schools, when we do the testing and the ranking and the test scores, the same HISD schools, predominantly children of color schools, end up at the bottom of the ranking. Year after year, year after year, year after year. We know which those schools are. We know how many students are in each one of those schools. If we did the math, how much money do we need to spend extra per student times the number of schools we're talking about, students? And the question is a simple one, but yet a very complex, because it's a profound question. And there's always a question behind the question. We have a lot of great education initiatives in this city. We have a lot of philanthropy, a lot of wonderful involvement in our community and foundations and money being put into education. But it seems that there is a gap in raising the real money we need per student, because we have an unwillingness to go to the community, to give the community the real number, the whole community, the entire community. People keep asking, and all of you in this room have told me one time or another, they asked you the same question, those of you involved in education, how can I help? What can I do? It always comes back to money. It seems to me there ought to be a campaign put together, an urban education fund campaign that raises the money from the citizens in this community who want to help those schools, help those students, out of empathy and care for the long-term investment that they will get returned by helping solve this gap. It seems very clearly, from the years of observing this as an observer, very passionate, involving observer as you are, that unless we go to the community, explain our need, put together the program to raise the money, put together the campaign to raise the money, give them a compelling reason to be involved in giving the money, then we're going to keep having this discussion.
Right.
Because it's not going to come from the state, it's not going to come from property taxes, it's going to come from individual. Everybody in this room can write you a check. I mean, I'd be able to write you a $5,000 check, $1,000 check, but I can write you a $100 check. There's enough money in this city, you get enough $100 checks, you get real money real quick.
You know, what I would add to that, Larry, is that we are already doing that. Parents are coming together to raise significant amounts of money, PTOs, in our wealthiest schools.
Yeah, of course they're in the wealthiest schools.
So what I'm saying is,
The poor schools can't do it.
right, but the fact that that is already happening, that people are getting organized, they do that every year in our wealthiest schools. Parents raise a lot of money
For their kids.
for their kids. Imagine if we could do that for the poorest students. So we know, I'm saying that to underscore what you just said. We know that the resources exist. We know that parents are willing to give above and beyond their taxes in order to support their children's schools. We need to have a conversation about changing that in order to support other people's kids who, by the way, it's a return on an investment. It's just going to benefit all of us.
So why is there not the willingness to do so? Are the others not deemed as fully human? Are they not deemed as fully human beings to be helped? Is there the question that has not been put properly to touch the heart from an empathy standpoint? The road to equity is empathy. There's a message somewhere. There has to be a correct message that will get to the heart of the human being who you're asking to help save another human being. If not, then where do we go? Because we can't continue in this divided kind of world that we're living in. The education of our children going forward, the children of color, the predominant number of majority minority students who are the future of Houston, Texas, if they do not get the proper education that they need, Houston will not be able to compete as a city. We already found that out in many ways. We will not have the workforce we'll need. We will not have the safety of what people want in a city or from a city, because people are going to figure out a way to survive, all right, which means crime and robbery and burglars. All that plays into this. So the question becomes, where is enlightened self-interest? And how do you begin to have the discussion at a different plane, a different level? You know, the old phrase is, you change the narrative, you change the outcome. Obviously, we need to change the narrative, because the narrative that we've been using is not working. It's not reaching and touching people. It's not moving from here to here. And Bob's going to be able to jump in a minute, and he's got some great ideas.
I would love to hear some of.
So I'm going to stop there, because her and I, it's the same loop. It's the same loop. Now, I'll end on this. Those of you might remember Larry Sacknowitz, Howard Idea, Sacknowitz and Company. Larry would say to us right now, and he'd do it pro bono, he said, give me a couple of weeks. I'll put a campaign together. I'll bring the campaign and we'll present it to the city, we'll present it to the community. We can raise the money. He's done it for other things. There is a way to put the proper campaign together to involve the citizens who want to give to this endeavor. We'll stop there. It's open now. Bob had his hand up first. Bob was first. He's been waiting. Good.
You know, I respect you both so much, and I love you both, and you're both smarter than me, so I have to be careful in making my next point. But you do the math.
Just to make sure.
Oh, yeah. You do the math on what you just put forward, which I believe is undoubtedly true, but do the math. If you took just the bottom 20% of HISD in terms of numbers, that's roughly 40,000 students, times 12,000, instead roughly 500 million for just HISD. That's not a philanthropic, maybe it is, but that doesn't sound like a philanthropic campaign.
No,
That's
a community-wide campaign.
It's a tax
Policy, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very different way of funding schools than our current methods. I mean, you know, I could read this chart and say, if this is truth, then we've already lost. Is there an alternative truth? Is there another path to equity other than just spending? Or, you know, I'm not saying you couldn't convince the public, but that's a very big lift to convince the public.
Or perhaps we can leverage philanthropic dollars to then get to the tax dollars where the real money is
Yes, I've
at.
been turning to Oprah. So
Good evening, when I can sustain. I agree with everything you say, but I'm at the point of not asking people that don't like me to like me. It's just, so going out and saying, let's try to change your mind and have empathy, they don't empathize with. They're not. It's just, they've told us 1,000 times, I'm just not that into you like that. And so if we kind of do these kind of endeavors, I think that's my personal opinion. It's a waste of time to try to get people that don't like us to like us. They've already told us in our faces, we don't like you, leave us alone. And so can we spend all this time and energy on people that are like-minded so we can kind of get down the road? And that sounds kind of pessimistic, but I mean, I just pay attention to what people do and say, hey, look, you don't want to go out with me? You tell me you don't want to go out with me, I'm going to stop asking you to go out with you. You know, straightforward.
Okay, that's a good discussion. I'm just going to go down the line here, and I'll come to this side. How's that? That makes it easy.
To me, the best way to convince people would be to take a smaller subset somehow, you know, a pilot project, and that wouldn't cost nearly what you're talking about, and really show some success, because I think then you get one or two, or a feeder pattern into a high school working, it could really then people go, well, if you just extrapolate this out, you know, multiply it, it could work. Has that been tried?
We haven't, not here. No, we haven't done that, but there are a few, there's actually even a randomized control trial that was done in, I believe, don't quote me on this, I have to look it up, I think North Carolina. But there was a randomized control trial where they looked at the outcomes with like improving the funding. And yeah, so it has been tried. But I think that in order to convince people here, we would have to try it here in this context.
So in the spirit of narrowing in, I love this data too, and I think I have more of a question before we get to solutions. I'm curious about the set of assumptions, and not to get wonky, right? Which I love all of your wonkiness, Ruth, but just to understand the set of assumptions that went into this type of research. To where does the money go? Because I think that's what the funding community will think. The ones that can get past the naysaying will say, well, then where does this money go? And I think we're in a complicated funding environment because of COVID and all the money that came federally and where that went. And of course, it was a very condensed time frame, so it makes it hard to believe that you can spend that much money reasonably and strategically. Mm-hmm. So put that aside, what did this research say the money should really go to that directly benefits the poor students?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I'd be happy to send you a copy of that report that has all the details about their methodology and all their assumptions. They did have to make a lot of assumptions, of course, but they're all listed. But this money is primarily going toward labor costs. And I think that as far as like the research goes in terms of not just the biggest cost, but also the biggest rewards, that has a lot to do with who is actually teaching the students and can we actually pay enough to attract the right people to be in front of our students.
I just have an idea just about the messaging piece. We're kind of thinking about it from our perspective as people who care. We think, you should care. A lot of people don't, or they would be in this room, or they'd be advocating like we do. You have to figure out what it is they care about, and then figure out how this affects them. Mm-hmm. So the message should be around, well, you know what, you don't spend this money here, and here's the result of that, and this is how this affects you. Versus, you know, you should care because they're people too. They don't, I mean, it's just the moral appeal doesn't necessarily work for everybody. Right. When you can raise that kind of money for yourself, but you don't want to give to anyone else, you have to appeal to what they care about, their money. Mm-hmm. So how does it affect their money? And that's where your message is, and that's where your campaign is, to raise that money.
I agree, 100%.
And there is a campaign that can be put together like that because it's been done in other cities.
Just want to ask, is this data looking at K-12 in particular?
Yes.
Is there any studies on what happens when you place the investment in early childhood instead of?
Sorry. Say it again.
Is there any studies that show what happens when you put the investment in early childhood instead of starting in kinder? Because it seems like a lot of this is game over by the time kids are into the public school system.
Now, I would rephrase that. I wouldn't say game over, but you're absolutely right that a lot of really important things happen in early childhood. And in fact, our research team has done quite a few research briefs focusing on early childhood. And there are some studies that have even tried to estimate the returns on that investment, which is very tricky, but usually they're short time interval. The longer returns are harder to estimate, and especially because of the fact that so much has intervened, that then often the effects kind of dissipate over time. And it doesn't mean that it's not important, that what happens in early childhood isn't important. It just means that there's so much that happens in the intervening years. We've got to sustain So ideally, we would want significant investments in early childhood before they start school and then keep it up during school. But right now, what we're seeing is that any differences that we see before at the start of school, they tend to be exacerbated there's like a cumulative effect over time. And so we need both, but you're absolutely right that early childhood is very, very important, as I'm sure they would agree.
I have a question back here.
Yes.
Great presentation, thank you for the data. I'm quite wonkish myself, so a bit more curious about like how this money, if we were to be able to get this kind of funding, how could it be distributed? Because this chart shows funding needed for the lowest quintile, right?
Right.
And I mean, you wouldn't walk into a school and just say, let's figure out where the poorest kids are and then, fund them, right?
Well, actually, we can do that.
Can you? Really?
Yes, we have that information. We know who our poorest students are. We keep track of that. So yes, we can target the funding to aim for equity.
But what does that look like? Because presumably they're in the same classes as people, as students, in other socioeconomic status.
Right.
Is it additional tutoring? Is it?
It could be exactly
additional
that.
classes.
It could be targeted programming, or it could also just be, instead of something that is targeted, it could be a universal program, a program that is available to everyone, but a program that we know has a greater benefit for the most disadvantaged students. There are several examples of that. By the way, pre-K is one example of that. We did the research here in Houston. My research team did that, and they saw that pre-K is beneficial to everybody, but it's even more beneficial for poor students. So that's an example of universal, but greater benefits.
Thank you. I always love learning. I'm going to go back and change some things in my grants now. But I have been in nonprofit fundraising for 20 years in children's education. And I think that we've heard some great things about the messaging and finding what it is. Is it an emotional giver? Is it an education, based giver? I think for me, one of the best things that I came up with when I was asking for money was the 3rd grade testing model. And that the state of Texas was modeling how much they were going to create their budget for later based on 3rd grade scores. And when people would hear that, I would say it out loud in meetings, that education really does have a lot to do with our criminal system later. And I'm in a nonprofit now that we do pre-K through high school, 26 years, finding the little models that are doing it. She was talking about that, finding some places that have done it successfully. We're 80 students to 200 a year, but after 26 years, most of them have gone to college. So, I think that there are people out there to ask and start these groups with different language.
And different messaging.
Yeah, and I feel like it's the messaging.
So I've also been in nonprofit fundraising for more than 20 years. Our 2 children came up through HISD. I knew how to get them into the Magna programs and all that, understood. The idea of a community PTO, community PTA, like a community chest, precursor to United Way. And again, assuming a certain level of success and non-success in an environment where some people don't like you. Other people are exhausted paying their school taxes and butting their heads against the ISDs. There's a lot of distrust of the management of funds, especially in HISD. We all know there's a lot of great stuff going on, but there's a lot of problems as well. So, I'm sort of thinking aloud here, which is how I do it, y'all. How would we position this investment in the greater good, in the greater sustainability and well-being of our city, as a community PTO? And then you have to get somebody trusted, of course, to administer it.
Right.
And all the data.
But I like that label. What do you think, Larry?
Yeah.
The community PTO.
It would work.
Take it.
It would work.
Thank you for being here and sharing your information with us. My background is teaching young adults in the apprenticeship program. You know, if you know a tradesman who's out there in the field, you know, they can make some decent money doing them. So I like the idea about the community involvement, but when you look at a socially economic challenged community, a third ward in Kashmir, a fifth ward, that community doesn't have a lot to give, a lot of resources to give to that school. But those individuals that are high achievers in that school, when they get into the trades and they start, you know, making a living, from the words of the mayor, they move to the lands, the woodlands, sugar lands, bear lands. Bring those individuals back to their community and give back, and then we have this community chest circulating again.
All right.
That's a great idea too.
So I'm fundraising and everything. We're early childhood literacy, nonprofit. But I do believe that most people do care. There are some that don't. They're like, what's in it for me? So the messaging has to be the head and the heart. The workforce for the future and the cost, but lots of people really do care. I mean, I see it every day with our funders, none of whom have children who are in our programs, you know? So I just want to throw that out there as a little sparkle of hope. But I think the best idea, and I was going to say, oh, he's already gone, but I was going to say what the gentleman behind Armando, who was sitting here, said about doing a smaller but decent sized test.
Oh, make a pilot.
Do a pilot and be very transparent about these are the resources, this is what we're doing, these are things that, you know, we're lowering the class, whatever all the things are, and prove it. Once you prove it here in HISD, then I think you could do it. I really do. But we have to
Do we have another 2036 idea, Larry?
Yeah, I'm writing it
We
down.
have to prove it. Because people don't trust, like you said. People don't trust.
Well, no question, I have a comment. I'm exhausted with pilots.
Thank you, Reagan.
I also don't have a question. I often get in trouble because I say the quiet part out loud. And so part of the trouble that we're facing is that people who have the means, if we decide we're going to invest in making public schools better, will just move their children to private schools. And so the problem still exists, regardless of whether we get a community PTO together or not. If we want to fix public school education, we have to eliminate the ability to have private education.
Believe it or not, I actually heard, I won't say where I got this information, but I actually heard someone say to me that Warren Buffett, y'all know who that is? Okay. Warren Buffett said, your buddy? Yeah. Warren Buffett said that the way to fix public education is to eliminate private schools. He said that.
Well, I didn't hear him say it.
Yeah, I was saying. So you got some company there.
I'm just saying.
I'm not necessarily suggesting we do this. I see the point though. I definitely see the point. Yes.
My suggestion would be from a equity standpoint and an empathy standpoint, if you could impose a sharing instead of a tax from everybody that's up here to bring the bottom into the, if we know the richest schools raise all the money, then you could take a small percentage of that as their kind gesture to being part of the solution to the problem. I think that, if it could be imposed around the whole thing, would make those numbers come together. If there was we could suggest it as an empathy and equity tax, but it wouldn't be, it would be like profit sharing, like the national professional leagues where the richer teams share, they're forced to share. You see what I'm saying? To make it an equal playing ground. So I think from a private, I mean, you gotta be realistic. You can't just eliminate the private school or the public sector. you want people to share. You see what I'm saying? So if you take from the most and then give to I mean, that could be
That's what our school lending model is.
Yes.
Anyone else on this side? I got one more comment over here.
Do we have time for last comment?
Uh-huh.
All right.
There you go, and then I'll turn it back to you, and then I'll make a
No, we gotta end it on a positive
I
note.
told Larry, so I didn't know what him to give me the mic again. But I've been working in higher education for the last 25 years or so. And I would know we spend a lot of funding on students that really struggle, and then a lot of money on our really advanced students. But you have huge groups of students that are those C, kind of B minus students that kind of float in the middle somewhere. And it's a huge group of them. And in the nonprofit I volunteer with, we focus on those students to get them from some C students to be an A and to be an A students. And so maybe the ask is, we're not trying to go necessarily at first for the lowest students that are hardest to move, but those students we can get some real progress from, those students in the middle that just a little bit of help can be in A students and kind of and show some real progress, and then start putting some time in those students that need a little more help.
I totally see that logic, that reasoning. Can I just end on this comment though? I'm one of those students that grew up in the lowest poverty quintile. Yeah, so you gotta, I'm very glad to hear that, because, not glad, I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but you know what I mean. That there is so much raw talent in our community that, my goodness, like, if it were not for the individuals that stepped into my life and invested in my education at just the right time, I am positive that I would not be in the situation that I'm in today. So it's not because of my hard work, and of course I did work hard. I don't want to pretend I did not work hard. I worked very hard, but that's not the reason why I am in the position that I am today. It's because a set of people actually rallied around me and supported me, and including financially, and that changed my life and it changed my trajectory. And that's why I do what I do now, because I see those poor students that are just like how I grew up, and I feel like, what a waste of talent, what a waste of, there's so much. So that's really the reason that I'm interested in doing this, and I actually think maybe that should be part of the messaging, right? To get people really encouraged to do something, but I do think that there are lots of things that we can and should do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. So here we are, in the resegregated environment of schools, in a majority-minority reality of Houston and the surrounding area, in the changing demographics that are only going to get more brown and black as we go forward, what are we going to do to save those children of color? And who's going to do it? And how is it going to be done? And by whom? So the question still is the question on the table where we began. It always has been about money and funding. I read from Jonathan Coles's book, Savage Inequality. He said, how do we know money is not the solution? Because we've never tried. We've never put enough money into public education. We've tried. So the dollar amount that Bob did the math on and added up that big number, here's what I know about Houston. That's chump change. That's shoeshine money. I've seen money raised in this city for projects that we get serious about, all right, from people who you never thought would give a dime to that project. But there was a way and a person who they trusted that touched them to be able to get them to write that check. Somebody used the word relationships earlier. It is all about relationships. It's relationships built, nurtured, and maintained on mutual trust and respect, because nothing happens without trust. And nothing happens without trust. People do not do anything for or to people they do not trust. I'd rather raise the spectrum of racism that is still very much the 100-pound gorilla in the room, all right? But I love Sari Steinweiner's definition of racism, the Center for the Healing of Racism that she directs. Racism is an emotional attachment to ignorance. Racism is an emotional attachment to ignorance. So we're going to always have the racists with us. You're not going to change their hearts and minds. But there's enough of the other people. There are enough of the other people who want to help, who want to serve, who want to give. We just have to figure out a way to reach them, to touch them. There's a message. There's a campaign. There's a proper way to do it. We just have to figure it out. It is a civic issue for the common good. Well, how do we define the common good going forward? And I'll refer to our friend, Steve Kleinberg Houston. He tells you very clearly what the demographics is and what's happening and why people are wanting to change and don't want to change. Either fear of losing something or giving something up or being replaced. The fear of losing something, giving something up, or being replaced. We have to tell people that's not the issue. The issue is a collective multicultural community that understands pluralism going forward, or we have no future. As simple as that, we have no future. And so this us and them thing, there has to be a way to work through that. 2036, the project is trying to figure out how to do some of those. This is a good start this evening. I want to thank you all for being here. The card on your chair is the next one, which deals with women in the economy. So goes the woman, so goes the household, so goes the children, so goes the next generation.
So goes the economy.
So goes the economy. So if women are not empowered, please join us for this wonderful discussion. Randy's is going to lead that discussion. And we're going to have a wonderful kind of looking at this issue. That's March. In April, we're going to look at the civic side of the political public policy that has to be done. Mustafa Tamiz is going to lead us in that discussion along with some other people. And in March, April, in May, we're going to go end with the spiritual part. Stuart Nelson of the Institute of Spirituality and Health will lead us in that section. The equity question is on the table. The empathy question, obviously, is on the table also as we go forward. But it is dual. So I'll end with one last comment. I want to thank Dr. Ruth again. I'm going to call that for this reason. Big-heartedness, compassion, kindness, and vision. Ruth has it. Now, there's a spectacular evening coming up that I just had to share with you on April 12th at the Museum of Fine Arts, brought to you by the Kinder Institute at Rice University. Ruth Simmons and Ruth Lopez Turley, the two Ruths, the two biblical name Ruths, which means grace, the two women of grace with passion and perseverance around this issue of education who are going to be together in a discussion. I think you all want to be there. Just go to Rice University's website. You can look it up in the Kinder Institute, April 12th, Museum of Fine Arts, the two Ruths. And so we're going to close on this. There's a wonderful poem that ends with this sentence. After a deeper searching of the heart, we all now rise to play a greater part. After a deeper searching of the heart, we all now rise to play a greater part. We have to figure out for each one of us individually and then collectively what's that greater part that we need to rise to save the children and the future generations, and therefore save Houston. Thank you all for coming tonight. We look forward to seeing you as we go forward.